Welcome to Studio Wesley Live. We're so excited to be with y'all again. It's been a minute, but we are back in business. And so I'm Derek Scott, and this is my friend Allison. Allison, how are you doing today?
I'm good. It's been a good weekend, so I'm excited to kind of end it with this. I think it's going to be a good, final. How are you, Derek?
I'm doing okay. There's a few things happening in my world, but ultimately, like, all is well, all will be well. And it's good to be with you tonight. And I'm super stoked about tonight's Studio Wesley Live. We've got David Finnegan-Honey, who's going to be hanging out with us. I'm super stoked. He is the author of Christ on the Psych Ward and Grace is a Pre-Existing Condition. So many things that David is, and I'm super excited to introduce folks to him. And so he's going to be talking to us tonight about a number of things related to mental health. He'll probably tell a little bit of his story as well, dealing with mental illness. And what are you excited about? Anything in particular that we might hear from David tonight?
Man, I feel like there's so much that goes into this kind of one subject of like the intersection of faith and mental health. And it's something that we kind of touch on little bits and pieces throughout the Wellness Project, but I'm excited to have this one focus on it as opposed to, let's ask one tiny question to this person, but I want to like have that bigger over encompassing kind of resource on it.
Right. Mm-hmm. Super cool. Well, I can't wait. So I think we just should go ahead and bring David onto the stage. So
let's do it.
Welcome in David Finnegan-Honey. David, how you doing this evening?
Hello, I'm doing very well. Yeah.
Awesome.
Great to see you all.
David, we're so excited about you being here. Just quickly, tell us a little bit about you, a little bit about your journey and what brings you to this conversation around mental health and an intersection with faith.
Sure. Yeah. So, I live in Richmond, Virginia, and am a co-minister of a church called Bon Air Christian Church, which is the Disciples of Christ congregation here. But really excited to be here with you all because a lot of my background is in campus ministry. So I served in campus ministries in Eastern North Carolina and Washington, D.C. for about a decade before I came here to Richmond to take a congregation. So. Always excited to be talking to college students. I miss you all. I love what I do, but actually, what brought me to this work? I think I'll just say that it really was students in our campus ministry who really taught me the importance of honesty and storytelling when it comes to mental health challenges. So I can dive right in to that if you want.
You know what, David? I think we are all here for it. So we'd love for you to dive in and just really excited about all the things you're going to say tonight. So without further ado, David, you've got center stage. Take it away.
Yeah. So, I want to talk a little bit tonight just about the power of story. And like to preface this just by naming that I'm going to share some of my story of mental health challenges and a couple things to say. One is that does mean that I'm going to talk a little bit about self-harm and suicidal ideation. Those are tough topics. I don't go into any kind of graphic detail or anything like that, but just kind of good to have a heads up for you that that's coming up. The second thing, right, is like my story is just my story. It's not a universal story. It's not everybody's story. And so it's a story that I tell because I think it helps create storytelling space for others. And so, my hope is always when I talk about myself that that's not the end of the conversation, that's the beginning of a big, wide, deep conversation, which I know you all are doing here at Studio Wesley, right? So I feel really good about that. There's a lot. There are a lot of other stories and a lot of other voices that we need to have in the conversation if we're going to have the big, deep conversation that we need to have about mental health and about mental health care in our faith communities and in the country. I mentioned that it was college students that kind of helped me see the importance of talking about this. So let me just give you a little bit of background. In 2011, I was in seminary, so I was training to be a minister. I had finished my first year of seminary. And overall had like a great experience. I really enjoyed it. I enjoyed the friends I was meeting and the relationships I was building and the things that I was learning in classes. And so it was a bit of a mystery to me, like why I entered into the summer following that first year of seminary, feeling like my life was just kind of coming apart at the seams internally. I wasn't quite sure why. And so I found myself really struggling with just kind of the spiral down into this kind of this interior darkness. I was experiencing suicidal ideation, struggling with self-harm. And then in the afternoons, after I struggled to get out of bed in this sort of dark basement apartment in Northeast DC, I would go to class. I'd go to take Hebrew, biblical Hebrew, and except for a few people, kind of managed to put on this face as if everything was really just okay. But things got worse and worse and worse. And finally, some friends started asking what was going on. And I ended up making a call to the National Suicide Lifeline, which, by the way, is now reachable at a 3-digit number, 988. So that's something important to keep in mind. And finally, with the help of some friends and colleagues, I checked myself into the psychiatric ward for the first time in my life. It would not be my last, because what happened is I was there for a couple weeks and got a couple of possible diagnoses, got put on some medication, and seemed a little stabler, seemed like maybe I was going to be okay. I left the hospital, thought, oh, back to life. And then a few weeks later, I was back in, and then out again. And then a few weeks later, back in. And it just became pretty clear that this kind of short-term hospitalization was not going to do the trick when it came to getting me to a place of safety and of stability and the kind of the health, the wholeness that I wanted to be able to live my life. So I ended up in a much longer term hospitalization. And it was during that time that I was diagnosed with bipolar disorder. I have something called type 2 bipolar disorder, and was put on some new medications because of that, and also had some new therapies, some new coping skills that seemed to be able to kind of quell this inner storm that had been raging inside for more than 6 months at this point. And then I went back home which was Washington, D.C. at the time. And things were just really, really hard for like a really long time. So I was like better. I was more stable, but still hard to get out of bed. I couldn't go right back into my seminary classes. I was on medical leave. And so I felt a sense of like purposelessness, of sort of drifting. What was there? It was hard to get out of bed, and what was there to get out of bed for, right? And during that time, I started working with a group of college students in a campus ministry that I had been intended to start in sort of a seminary internship in the fall, and then I'd gone into the hospital. But I'd like already met some of the student leaders and some of the folks I was going to be working with, and so it felt like I owed a little bit of an explanation, like why had I just ghosted them for 6 months? So the time came to give a sermon at one of our Thursday night worship services. And I decided I'd talk a little bit about my time in the hospital. And so there's this passage in the Gospel of John in the 15th chapter where Jesus calls the disciples his friends. So I talked about that a little bit. And I talked about how if Jesus needs friends, then maybe Jesus knows a little bit about what it means to be lonely. And that the hospital had been sometimes a lonely experience, but that part of being a follower of Jesus is this sort of deep soul level recognition that we're never alone, even when we feel that we are. And what I thought would happen, kind of what I figured that would do, is like hopefully it would be an okay sermon, and also just kind of let the students know, like, I'm okay now, right? And like, we're back at it. I'm back, here I am, I'm preaching, and we can kind of like get back to the ministry that we're supposed to be doing together and like kind of move on. Except that that's not at all what happened. What happened instead is that students started coming to me, usually one at a time, and saying things like, I really struggle with depression and anxiety, or I have a family member with a severe mental illness. It's really hard for them, and it's really hard on us. Or I've got a friend or a roommate or a classmate who's going through a really hard time right now, and we don't know what to call it, and I don't know what to do. And we didn't know we could talk about it in church. But now you have, so now we know that we can. And this was something on the order of a revelation for me. This was a real eye opener that by sharing a little bit of my own story. I had, but mainly by accident, sort of stumbled backwards into not moving on and getting on with ministry, but sort of realizing what ministry was all about. That this line, we didn't know we could talk about it here, right, is kind of what I return to over and over again in my own sense of vocation and call in addressing this topic of mental health and faith, right? Because like, not only can we talk about it here, not only do I want to get campus ministries and faith communities and churches on board with the fact that we can talk about this here, but that actually like talking about this here is what makes us, right? That talking about this here is actually our vocation. It's actually our call. It's actually what we're being formed and shaped for as the body of Christ. There is this verse, this one line in Mark's gospel in the 6th chapter, verse 30, chapter 6, verse 30. Let me read it so I don't mess it up here. It says, "The apostles gathered around Jesus and told him all they had done and taught." And I don't remember who first pointed out to me that the verse specifically says they told him all they had done and taught. All of it, everything. If you know anything about Mark's gospel, you know that the disciples struggle to do what they're supposed to do throughout Mark's gospel. And in fact, in this particular part, some really bad stuff has been going on. Jesus has gone back to his hometown, Nazareth. It's gone terribly. He hasn't been able to heal anyone there. John the Baptist, a friend and an ally of the movement, has been first arrested, imprisoned, and then executed. So like, things aren't going great, right? So here, this line, the apostles telling Jesus all they had done and taught. They've been sent out in twos to be in ministry. They've returned to Jesus. And you might think at first, like, all they had done and taught was sort of a bragging session of all the great stuff they had done. But this is Mark's gospel, and it's in the midst of struggle and strife. And so all the disciples had done and taught had to have included some pretty hard stuff, had to have included stories of doubt, stories of pain, stories of failure, stories of fear and anxiety. Some of the disciples had to share stories like, Jesus, this situation came up and I didn't know what to do. This person needed help and I wasn't sure how to help them. This thing happened and I felt really scared, or I felt really sad, or I felt really numb. And that was surprising to me because I thought I was supposed to feel something intense in this moment. Or I felt something so intense that I wasn't sure what to do with that. And so here's this image, right, of the disciples gathered in a circle around a fire, probably sharing a meal with Jesus, sharing all they had done and taught. And if that's not church, then I don't know what is. And so again, it's not just that we can talk about it here, but that what makes here is that we talk about it. Just a few verses later, Jesus and the disciples, through a miracle and through sharing, feed thousands of people by the lakeside. And so this talking about it turns into the activity of serving and feeding and loving the world around them. So in other words, we can talk about it here becomes we can talk about it here, and the love and the grace and the acceptance that we meet when we talk about it here can change the world. So in a way, right, this is about mental health, and this is about mental health challenges and being honest about them, breaking stigma, challenging silence around these very real, surprisingly common experiences that we have. In a broader sense, it's just about forming communities where we are able to have conversations about hard things more generally. I have a diagnosed mental illness. It has a neat label in the DSM and everything like that. But all of us face mental health challenges of some kind during our life. None of us get out of this thing unscathed, right? We all face times where our emotions are a jumble, where we're not sure how to sort through them. We face times of grief, of loss, of pain, of hurt. And we talk about that. And rather than that turning us into an insular community, right, that just faces inwards, the honesty about that makes us more and more aware, more and more empathetic and compassionate for the hurt in the world around us. And that leads us out into that world. And when it comes to mental health, that leads us out into that world to ask questions like, why is it so hard for some people to get help? What are the barriers, the access to the care that people need? And what can we as a faithful Christian community that follows Jesus do about some of that as well? So this is just like a vision of church, an image of church, right, to put out there for you. That's what brings me into this conversation. It was first and foremost my experience of mental health challenges, sorting through that challenge, that new challenge, as a person of faith, as a seminarian, learning how to be in ministry. And this realization, right, that my college students helped me see, that like this is now a thing I bring into ministry with me, whether I want it or not. This experience of bipolar disorder, these experiences of hospitalization is now, it's part of the lens that I have on when I read a scriptural text, when I prepare a sermon, when I'm sitting in the room with someone to offer pastoral care or to offer a listening ear. That's part of my reality that I bring to that, just like each and every one of us, right, has dozens and dozens of things that make up our reality that we bring into the ministry that we do. So, I'm hopeful that with stories like these, with conversations like these, with the kind of conversations that Studio Wesley is promoting, we can become the place where people can talk about it, and the place where talking about it here leads to this bigger and deeper and wider conversation about how we can make sure that more people in our communities and in our country and in the world can seek the care they need, can find that care, find accessible and affordable care, and that we can, in doing that, right, make healthier communities and a healthier world. One final little story. Towards the end of Mark's gospel, there is a part where Jesus encounters a man named Bartimaeus, and he heals Bartimaeus, and then the disciples move on their way up to Jerusalem from Jericho, where they've been coming. But in that story of the healing of Bartimaeus, it's in the 10th chapter of Mark's gospel, there is a word that's repeated multiple times, and that word is call. The crowd says to Bartimaeus, he's calling you. Jesus calls Bartimaeus, and they encourage him and they say, get up, you got to go to him. He's calling you. And it happens 3 times right in a row, the word call. It's in the original text too, in the original language. It's phoneo, the word in Greek, like telephone, right? The thing you use to call someone. So this is a story about call. And what I want to sort of like put out there for you this evening is that what Bartimaeus gets called to do, first and foremost, isn't to follow Jesus. That's where the story ends, but it's not where it begins. What Bartimaeus gets called to do first is to experience healing. Jesus even asks, like, look, what do you want me to do for you? It's a question he asked James and John a few verses before that. And they were like, we want to be at your right hand and your left hand. And Jesus is like, okay, like, yeah, you haven't really gotten it, huh? But here's this kind of man just by the roadside who gets it more than the disciples does. And he says, well, what I want is to experience healing. We're called to healing, right? We're called to the vocation of healing. And that means that we are called to experience healing for ourselves. What that means is that if you are struggling, if you are in a dark or a difficult place right now, the act of reaching out for help, the act of telling people that, hey, I'm going through this right now and I'm not sure what to do, the act of going to the counseling or to walking someone to the counseling center or setting up an appointment with a psychiatrist for the first time. Those can be like big, scary things, right? You're called to experience healing. We're called to spread that healing to the world, but you are also called as an individual to seek that healing, because what we're doing here is the work of the common good, and you also are part of the common good. So if this evening or whenever you're listening to this, you're that person who's in a difficult place, you're that person who is needing help, I'll just share the words of Mark's gospel with you. Take heart, arise. Jesus is calling you. And what Jesus is calling you to do, first and foremost, is to experience the healing and the wholeness that we were all created for. So I'll stop there. I'll kind of stop lobbing there. And I think Derek and Allison, I don't know if you have some questions for me, or we can chat more. Yeah.
gotta name the holy moment that at least is happening in my room right now, of just the way you just unpacked that those sections of Mark's gospel, but also the way that you told your own story. And I just want to thank you for being willing to do that. Like, my gosh, like, just there's so many things. And I'm going to go into some Q&A here, and I've got a few questions for you. And then in a little bit, Allison's going to come back on as well. But I just first, again, thank you so much, David, for just being willing to share with us tonight. Just so much good, affirming and helpful thoughts that you've brought to the table. So let me ask this: what if I have a friend or a family member, church member, somebody in my campus ministry who needs mental health care, but part of this is that we haven't talked about it. I do think that it's tragic that that many of us don't feel like we can talk about mental health in church, but we know that someone in our sphere of influence needs some attention, but they don't want to ask for it, or they maybe even refuse to help. Tell us a little bit of how we can support those individuals who need help, professional help, not just our sitting with them at coffee, but need some real legitimate help. How do we come alongside them and help them?
Yeah. So there's I think like a couple of layers to this question, right? One is like actually the sitting with somebody at coffee thing is really important, right? And so being people ourselves who are kind of safe people and people that somebody can talk to is a huge thing, right? So I want to like just lift up the importance of that. And part of why I found it important to kind of share some of my own story, right, is that's one way of saying like, hey, look, like we can talk about this, right? This isn't too scary or too painful to talk about. Like, it can be done, right? There's also like the sort of baseline of knowing the resources on your campus or in your community, right, that you can help somebody access. And sometimes that's as simple as like knowing where the counseling center is and being willing to walk with somebody to that, because that can be a really lonely, scary thing, right? So knowing your resources. I'll mention several times some tools for learning some like basic skill sets for responding. So one I'll put out there is mental health first aid trainings, which I think mentalhealthfirstaid.org is the website. You can find trainings in your area or bring a trainer to you. And just like with regular first aid, right, that doesn't turn you into a doctor, right? It just gives you some basic skills to kind of help provide some stability until a professional can get there, right? So similar with mental health first aid, right? Just giving you some basic knowledge, some basic understanding, some basic ways of responding. So that's kind of like baseline, some things we can do to be prepared to be helpful. By far the hardest question that I get is the one about like how to help somebody who doesn't seem to want help or is kind of being like refusing help. And that's like really, really hard for me to answer, especially if I'm not there and I don't know the person and I kind of can't interact with the person. But like, look, let me just say, I have bipolar disorder. I am trained as a minister. I have served as a chaplain. I'm a pastor. I don't always know how to help. Right? So just like, I don't always know either. And certainly like from a distance, I'm not always able to help. And that can be really, really hard if you're the person impacted by that situation, right? So let me like, again, just kind of affirm that can just be a really stressful situation. A couple of things I know. If we shatter silence and break stigma, right? So if we talk about it here and we create spaces where it's very clear that we can talk about it here, more people will get help. Because stigma is a really, really powerful force. It's a deeply internalized thing. It is still easier for me to think of calling in to work and saying, I've got a really bad stomach ache, than it is for me to think about calling in and being like, hey, bipolar doing its thing today, right? So like that stigma's in me as well, right? So we have to be really intentional about that. If we do that, more people will get help. If we work and advocate for more equitable systems so that help is actually available to people, so that it is accessible and affordable, then more people will get help. And if we challenge the sort of societal, we'll call it another type of stigma, just around reaching out to help for anything. If, for example, like we think through how we shape masculinity in a way so that men think that asking for help somehow is weakness, or how we shape examples of what it means to be a woman. So that means you have to keep all of the balls up in the air at all time and you're never allowed to let one drop. If we challenge the idea that the American ideal is John Wayne and John Wayne never asked for help, right? Like if we start like, let's find some healthier images for what it means to be a healthy person in the world. If we do that kind of work, more people will ask for help, right? So there's like 3 things I know that we can do. And if we're doing those 3 things, and if we're doing if we're reaching out and asking for help when we need it, right? Because it's really easy to be like, well, that person needs help, right?
Right.
Like,
Yeah.
am I seeing a counselor, or am I doing those things? If we are doing all those things and we're running up against a situation where it just seems really hard and scary and we're not sure what to do, right? Then like sometimes uncertainty is the faithful thing. Sometimes there's a great story I'll just share real quickly. Parker Palmer, who's a Quaker educator and author, and who's talked about his own struggles with clinical depression, tells a story of a friend of his who also suffered with depression. And the 2 of them were talking, and she asked him this really hard question. They had friends who had died by suicide. And she said, Parker, like, why are we alive? Like, why did we lose friends and the 2 of us like are alive? And he like didn't know what to say. And he went home that night like kind of beating himself up because he's this like world-renowned educator, right? And he was like, I should have had something better to say than I don't know. And about a week later, she wrote him a letter and thanked him for saying, I don't know. Because she said, Parker, I've asked other people that question and people have tried to give me an answer. And it's been really awful. Like it's been really inhumane that people, the answers that people came up to give, that, this idea that, maybe I have more faith than those people or I'm better than those people somehow, those seemed really awful to me. And so you just saying like, I don't know, was like really healing, right? The fact that there's just some mystery in this. There's just some painful parts about being uncertain humans in an uncertain world. And sometimes the best thing we can do is acknowledge that uncertainty is there, because that's exactly that kind of honesty that I think then helps us create more healing spaces.
Woo! Oh my gosh, so much, David. Those 3 specific points, but also just the need we don't always need to have an answer, but that presence and being available and just being in the space, letting people know they're not alone, and lifting up coffee. I mean, that is actually something in my world that like just sitting and holding space for each other's stories. So much, it's so good. Let me move to another question, because if I don't, we're going to be here all night. So you were talking about a moment ago, you were talking about those who, we need to advocate for more access to healthcare, because there is a huge disparity, both around age group, but also economics as well. And so I'm curious, we know I'm a person who needs some mental health care, needs some support on a professional level, but I don't have access to it. I can't afford a therapist necessarily. What would you say to us? What would you advise to groups of friends or communities, campus ministries even, where access to mental health care is really hard to come by?
Yeah. So on an individual or on a personal level, if you're someone who's interested in knowing how to offer help, again, knowing your resources, not being afraid to reach out, particularly for counseling, and saying, I can't afford it. What can I do? There are a whole lot of therapists out there who will provide sliding scale, or who will provide a couple of free sessions. Check in with if you look for pastoral counseling centers in your area, they will often have sliding scale options. There's also some great resources online of like lists of affordable therapists in regions. So it's worthwhile to do a little research. And by the way, this can be really tough if you're the person who's really going through it, right? So having a friend who can maybe do some of that reaching out for you might be a really helpful thing. That might be a kind of help you can ask for, right? Like, hey, friend, like I'm really having a hard time even just picking up the phone and calling somebody, right? So like on an individual level, like reaching out and finding those resources. And also, right, we've got a systemic problem, which is that there is just an inequitable level of access to care. But part of why I start by saying my story is just my story is like that long-term hospitalization that was so helpful for me, not in reach for a whole lot of people in our country. I've given talks in small rural churches, right, where people are like, that was a great story. The only thing is, like, you went to the hospital and then got onto the psych ward. There's not a psychiatric bed within 50 miles of this church, right? So part of this is like lifting up voices to push for more public forms of change and kind of keeping the protections we have. I don't want to get too far into the political weeds, right? But until really the Affordable Care Act, there really just was not a lot of legal protection for people with pre-existing conditions, which like bipolar was one. So I ended up in massive amounts of medical debt because insurance companies wouldn't cover me. And so we've got to like protect the protections that are there. And then like, if you buy one of my books, like the royalties for that book go to an organization called RIP Medical Debt that helps people abolish the medical debt that they end up in, because medical debt is a huge, huge systemic problem that we have that prevents people from seeking care. People end up in debt, then they don't go to the doctor, they don't go to seek therapy. And it turns into this really vicious cycle. So that's one of the things I started with my second book, Race is a Pre-Existing Condition, which talks a bit more about these kind of systems level issues. Is we started like kind of taking the profits from that, which by the way, like aren't a lot. Don't write a book if you want to make profit, but go to this organization called RIP Medical Debt. They buy up portfolios of debt and then just abolish them instead of collecting on them. So that's a great resource.
Awesome. And
we could talk. I mean, we could talk like all night, right? About that one topic. Like, there's like so much more out there in terms of the advocacy work there. But just to kind of give a like quick, baseline for it, anyway.
What I think one of the things I'm hearing, as far as like community and supporting individuals with mental illness is not waiting for these moments of crisis, but really beginning to have a bigger conversation about how we support each other and how we make space for each other. How do we make sure that before there is an acute moment, that people know they can talk about mental illness in the space? How do we do it? And so that's, I think, another good question that I'd love for you to maybe respond to is, how do we think about, our campus ministries, possibly local churches, and even just communities in general? How do we think about them as spaces that include and are safe for individuals who are working through mental illness, mental health crises? How do we make those spaces more inclusive?
Yeah. So I'll name a couple of resources. The first thing I'll mention is, because I mentioned it already, mental health first aid training, which is it's a great practical tool, but it's also a thing you can do as a community that like makes it clear that you're talking about this, right? So like if a congregation hosts a mental health first aid training and puts that out into the community, like the congregation will learn some really important skills, but you're also saying like, hey, neighbors, right? We see you, we hear you, right? This is what's going on in the lives of the people around us, and we're not kind of ignoring that or apathetic to that as a church. One thing I'll mention with mental health first aid training is, think about the people who are most likely to be the first responders in a mental health crisis. It's not always the types of leaders who seek out mental health first aid training aren't always actually the first person on the job. So I'll give you an example. In a congregation, I'm the pastor, but a lot of times like the usher or the greeter, the person at the door, the person who picks up the phone, right, the secretary, they're actually the first person
Right.
the first responder, right?
Right.
When I took my first mental health first aid training, I was there with a group of hospital security guards. So think about a whole building full of medical professionals in a hospital, and who's the person who's first on the scene? It's a hospital security guard, right? So giving them some basic tools, right, until the professional can get there. Because look, it can be a long time until the professional can actually respond, even in a hospital setting, much less anywhere else. So first thing I'll name mental health first aid. The second thing I'll say is you can start really simple. I was on the phone one time with a pastor from Chicago. His church had done a community organizing project in which they'd interviewed members of the community and leaders in the community to find out what the needs were around this church. And mental health rose right to the top. But neither he nor his congregation knew what to do about that. So he's talking to me and he says to me, the first thing I could think of to do was, we have this time in our worship called Prayers of the People. And we name, things we're praying for. So I got up that first week in front of the congregation and I prayed for people with depression. And then the next week I prayed for people with anxiety disorders. And the third week I prayed for people with bipolar disorder. Now, I have bipolar disorder. I talk about it a lot. So I'm not like fragile about it, right? But I actually got like choked up when he said that, because here was this person I never met, this like total stranger to me, who like named me in prayer, right? In a way that doesn't often happen for me in churches, right? At least churches where I'm not the one doing a lot of the blabbing, right? And so that's really, really powerful, a really powerful experience for me as somebody with bipolar disorder. And what did it take? It didn't take any additional programming. It didn't take any budget. It didn't take, right? It took him saying that in a prayer, in the worship service, right? So like just a really simple thing that you can do that really makes for a huge impact. So yeah, you can, right, you can start small. And then, the third thing is, I think, is like, what do we need to do to be kind of communities of story sharing? And there's a lot to talk about there in terms of like good boundaries and making sure nobody feels pressured to share, and that, we're actually creating safe places for people to share stories, not just kind of forcing the point. But I think as communities, just thinking through like, well, what would it look like for this to be like a place where I felt really safe to share my story? What would kind of need to be in place? And again, sometimes those conversations are remarkably, I hesitate to say simple, because they can be complex, but they're not necessarily complex processes, right? They're just, it's just like broaching the question and putting it out there and like thinking through like, okay, what could make this like a safe space for story sharing?
So helpful, David. So helpful. I want to bring Allison back on stage. And I've got a couple more questions for you, but I want to bring Allison back on stage. I've got at least one more question for you, David, and then Allison may have a question or two for you as well. So when you were talking, one of the things you said, and it really it got me, where you talked about when you were in the hospital, and the hospital being, unfortunately, this lonely place. And I was just wondering, and this may be over our heads, but and it may be outside of what we can do, but is it possible? We know that there will be some people who will need to go into hospital to deal with their mental health challenges, and we want to say that's progress, right? Like that's taking the proper steps to take care of oneself. Is it possible for communities to make that a less lonely moment for individuals?
Yeah. So that's like a really great question. And I'm going to give an answer that I wish I usually have a rubber band that I hold up. Imagine I'm holding a rubber band. Okay. When you've got a rubber band, you pull it in either direction, you're creating tension, right? The tension in a rubber band is how the rubber band does its work, right? It's not a design flaw, it's how it does the thing, right? So I'm going to use the word tension a lot here. We're holding tension, and we're holding the two sides of a rubber band in order to hold the thing together. Okay,
Mhm.
so I'm going to give you an answer where we're holding attention. The one thing I'll say is presence is really, 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 really important.
Mhm.
I had a lot of people who came to visit me in the hospital. I do not remember most of what they said at all. I do remember that people were there. Okay. So it is like so important. Like if you are able, if you know somebody who's in that place and you're able to and be healthy for yourself, to be able to, find out when visiting hours, go and sit with the person. It's huge. It's huge. Here's the tension. The person who's going through it, it might not seem like it's helping at all. Because like nothing felt like it was helping at the time, right? I felt lonely even though people were coming to visit me. And this is where like the ministry of presence is a real skill that you have to nurture and develop, because it's hard. Because what wouldn't have been really helpful for me at the time is if I were to say to somebody, like, I feel really lonely. If they were to be like, David, what do you mean? What's wrong with you? Why would you feel lonely? I'm right here, right? Now, they probably felt like that, right? Because they took you guys aren't in DC, they took the X2 bus to come visit me, right? That took some work, right? So that's hard to hear, right? And so part of it is like when you're supporting someone, you also need your own support, because you need to be able to like go to somebody else and say, oh man, like David said this to me and it was like really hard to hear, right? But like what was helpful was people being able to hold space for that feeling that I was having, because it was an honest feeling, even though it was like objectively untrue in a sense, right? Like I wasn't alone. But like to be able to hold that space and say things like, that sounds really hard. Like that, I can tell you're really hurting. Like I can tell that would be, if I felt like that would be a really hard thing for me to be feeling, right? So we can like affirm the reality that someone is experiencing without necessarily like confirming that reality is sort of objective truth, if that makes sense. Like my interior voices were saying things to me like, you're a worthless piece of crap, right? And like, I think like my mom came to visit me, right? She really wanted to argue with me about that, right? But like I wasn't going to hear that, right? I wasn't going to kind of be able to hear that. But the sort of affirming presence, the being able to hold space, that's a real skill that we can nurture. So like presence really matters, and in that presence, we have to develop a comfort with the sort of felt experience of absence that the other person is having. So that's a piece of it. The other thing I'll say, like for students who are discerning what your calling to ministry is going to look like in the future, because you're all called to ministry in one form or another. But like there is a real need for mental health professionals and also for like hospital chaplains who do this work of trying to make like the experience of the hospital a less lonely place full time. And so if this is like something, we're talking about this and you're like, what do we do about that? Like, how do we help with that? Like that, that might be a little voice of the spirit whispering something to you. So pay attention to that. I'm duty bound to say that my spouse is a hospital chaplain. So
yes.
But it's there's calling in that. If you're hearing us talk about this and you're like, that's something I care a lot about.
Before I ask one more question, Allison, I just wanted to see if you had anything that you wanted to put on the table, because I've dominated the question asking tonight.
You're good, because you know what? Actually, I always have this pen and pen and paper next to me, and I always aim for questions, but I just kept writing down things you were saying, David. Like I never even got to the writing down question part because I was like, I want to remember that. I remember this. I want to quote that later. And so I didn't even get to like question part of it because I was so into taking notes. Even just now you're answering Derek's questions and I'm on screen like scribbling down stuff that you're saying. So Derek, feel free to go ahead and ask that second question.
Well, and this question actually comes, it's a two-part question. A friend of mine stepped into the live and they had to step right back out, but they heard a little bit of the stuff that you were talking about, David, and we were earlier, this friend of mine, we were earlier talking about this tweet that we both saw about a celebrity right now, and I'm not going to name the celebrity, but a celebrity right now is making some different statements, anti-Semitic, anti-Black racist statements right now. Yeah. And the way that some of the commentators across media platforms are sort of responding is saying this person has bipolar disorder. And so that's the reason why they're saying these things. And the tweet that we both saw was from a person who was saying this really is damaging and harmful to those of us who have bipolar disorder, that we're blaming this behavior on this condition. And I just wondered if you had a thought or a response to sort of the ways that mental illness is portrayed sort of in the wider culture and how we might just think about that. And again, I'm thinking about this particular person. I think you know who I'm talking about right now. Yeah. And just how do we navigate that, both for ourselves as we're creating community, for all of us, inclusive community, but also those of us who struggle with mental illness. I struggle with anxiety, and so that becomes a point for me. How do you think about that? How do you respond to those moments that we see in the wider culture?
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, that's a really great question, and it's a complex topic, right? So we'll have to kind of hold a lot of complexity when we think about this.
Absolutely.
Right? Just to put a couple of things out there. One is, it is absolutely true that in some of kind of my worst times with like mental health crisis, I have said and done things that I regret and that like the best version of me would not have said and done. Right. So that is true. And it's an aspect of the struggle with mental illness that I want to hold and not try to kind of paper over. Right.
Yeah.
And if you're a friend and family member, I'm both somebody with mental illness and a friend and a family member of people with mental illness. That can be legitimately hard, right, and painful and hurtful, right? So having bipolar disorder doesn't mean I'm suddenly not accountable for my actions, right? It can be an explanatory factor, but if I hurt people, like I still need to like own up to that and apologize if that they're open to that, right? Kind of seek to rebuild a relationship if I've damaged it, and understand like my bipolar disorder is an explanatory factor, but like so are a lot of other things, right? And a lot of those things are things I need to own and kind of take some responsibility for, right? You know, like people don't just like have bipolar disorder and then say racist stuff. Like the racist stuff is out there in the water we're swimming in, and that's why the bipolar disorder can grab onto it, right? So right, that's an aspect of it that I think like accountability and relationship is still there, right? And so we still have to work on that. The other thing I'd say is like, and this is particularly when it comes to like the way mental illness is talked about around acts of violence that I think is important. There's a lot of scapegoating of mental illness that happens. And so, for example, if there is a mass shooting, right? Like when I hear news about a mass shooting, I try to like stop and like not say anything and like just part of it, just kind of like not be numb to it, like let myself experience the tragedy of this thing. And then I just wait, right? And if the person who did the shooting is somebody who looks kind of like me, then like before long we'll be talking about mental illness. And it's it makes me kind of furious, right? Because like, I'm not your scapegoat. Like, I'm not here so that politicians and community leaders can avoid talking about hard things that we need to talk about guns and gender and race and all sorts of stuff that we need to be talking about, to just say like, oh, it's mental illness, and then like continue underfunding care for mental illness.
Yes, yes,
right? Like,
yes.
like that's not why I'm here. I'm not your like convenient kind of scapegoat. So, you know, that's like a bit of a different type of situation than like this particular individual, who I do think genuinely, it is true, has bipolar disorder. But like, it's so easy to just kind of take that and make that as if it's like, as if that's an easy way out. And it's not, right? It's not in both directions. It neither, the fact that somebody has a mental illness neither means that we don't need to talk about all of the other things. And okay, so if mental illness is part of it, we've got major systemic issues with mental health care in this country. What are we doing about that, right? So I think that there's a kind of a, scapegoating is the word that always comes to mind for me of it, where why are we bringing up mental illness in this scenario? Who gets our compassion for having a mental illness and who doesn't, right? Who do we like kind of put in a scary, dangerous category because of mental illness, and who do we say, oh, you know, they have bipolar disorder, so they can say that stuff on their Twitter account with 50 million followers, you know? So yeah, I think, again, a lot of complexities here to hold, right? So, you know, I think there's not a simple thing to say, but that's kind of some of the thoughts that run through my mind.
Oh my gosh, David, that's so insightful and wise there, and really helpful. That term scapegoating, I think, is really, really a good way of thinking about this. And again, I think it's something that we don't want to be distracted by, so that we can be community for individuals, and also support those who are on their mental health journey, which we all are. We are all on our mental health journey. So, oh my gosh, David, there's so much, and we are literally like at time. So I'm Allison, if you want to jump in on anything, feel free. But David, how do we learn more about you and just what you have to support us in this journey and all the stuff that you're doing?
Yeah, sure. So I've got a website that has a lot of resources and talks and book information and things like that. And it's just my name. It's not myname.com. It's davidfinneganhosey.com. I don't know what myname.com is. Maybe don't look. But yeah, davidfinneganhosey.com is my website. And you can, there's a resources tab there. There's resources for folks in crisis, as well as information about like ordering my books. And there's some free kind of book study guides if you want to do like a study in your community, and then a lot of other resources as well. So yeah, that's the best. And then on the social media, I'm at Foolish Hosey on Facebook and Instagram, and the bird one. So yeah.
Awesome. David, thank you so much for sharing tonight. It was just so rich. Thank you so much, brother. We really appreciate you joining us tonight.
Well, thank you so much for having me. It's a privilege, and I hope for everyone listening that there is at least a nugget in here that was helpful or healing for you.
Oh, so much gold. So much gold. Thank you so much, David. Going to let Michael take you backstage. And we also want to thank Michael Yerrick for working tech for tonight's Studio Wesley Live. Okay, Allison, really quickly, because we are like right at time. What one thing that just like... Good luck, because I
have so many things written down, Derek. One. Okay. Gosh. I do think, and I don't know, out of all of them, I think this one's just important to rename that like aspect that he mentioned of the first responders, our typical knowledge of first responders, are not the first people to respond to something like this, because it sets me in that mind frame of like students, their friends, their peers, their classmates, living in a dorm room. Those first people who are there in those moments are not first responders. And so I think that that's just kind of important to name too, as we talk about peer support and how peers can help in those kinds of situations, because I think that is another thing that's just not talked about enough. What do you do when you're near someone who needs help? What is that next step? What do you do? And so I think that, I think that's probably just the most important that I want to rename, restate, put out there again.
Yeah. Oh man. I have to say there's so much I'm noting, and we've already noted that sort of internally, but the mental health first aid training, that is something that we will be leaning into through the Wellness Project coming soon. But the ministry of presence for me, and just the way that David even talked about his experience of being in hospital, and he's still lonely even though people came to visit him, and how important it was that people would come to visit him, knowing that they weren't going to fix it, and just that, so profound for me, and a challenge for me as a campus minister and a friend, right? Like that, being in the space is really important. So wow, this episode,
so many notes. And I want to name too that some of the stuff that he talked about, I will link when I reshare this. That way there's kind of more easier access. I'll probably even throw it in the comments later. That way it's all kind of there and available.
Awesome. Well, again, thank you, David Finnegan-Honey, for joining us tonight for Studio Wesley Live. It was so good. Allison, always a pleasure to be with you. And friends, thanks for joining us and watching and commenting and sharing and letting us know how you feel about our episodes throughout Studio Wesley Live and all of the things that we do through Studio Wesley and the Wellness Project, talking mental health, and cohorts are coming in the spring. You'll see more information about that as well pretty soon. So friends, thanks so much for joining us and have a great one. We'll see you next time for Studio Wesley Live.